have always felt that classifying Oscar Wilde's Faith's a Nightingale and the Rose Fay as a fairy tale is one of the cruelest jokes in literary history. Late tonight, as I turn the pages of this slender volume once more, what wafts from between the sheets is not the cozy warmth of a bedtime story, but rather a potent, nauseating stench of blood and rust. In our current era, an age that enshrines emotional stability as a sacred creed, where sunk costs are constantly on everyone's lips, and where every individual meticulously calculates their return on investment, Roy, reading this story feels nothing short of a prolonged psychological torture by 1,000 cuts. I gaze at the words on the page and feel a deep shudder run through me. With language of extreme opulence, verging on a morbid aestheticism, Wilde has wrapped a desperate thesis regarding the misplacement of value. This is by no means a paean celebrating the grandeur of love. It is rather an utterly asymmetrical slaughter waged between an idealist and a pragmatist. And the primary scene of this slaughter is not beneath the rosebush bristling with thorns, but rather before the window of that young student. The camera's lens focuses first upon the young student himself. She said that if I brought her some red roses, she would dance with me, cried the young student. But in all my garden there is not a single red rose. This would, by all accounts, be an utterly banal opening, a youth, just awakening to the stirrings of love, feeling despondent because he cannot satisfy the vanity of the girl who has captured his heart. Were this to happen today, he would be nothing more than a frustrated young man posting maudlin, self-pitying laments on his social media feed in the dead of night. But wait, let us pause. Let me cast a deeply scrutinizing gaze upon this boy and examine him closely. Will describes him thus: his hair was dark as the hyacinth, and his lips were red as the rose he desired. But passion had made his face like pale ivory, and sorrow had set her seal upon his brow. What a captivating vessel of flesh and blood, this physical shell, brimming with the fragile vulnerability characteristic of the intellectual, is utterly deceptive. He was a man of vast erudition, versed in philosophy, versed in logic. Yet there he sat weeping, as if bearing the weight of the entire universe upon his shoulders. But as I gazed into those eyes brimming with tears, a wave of irrepressible disgust rose within me. Was he truly weeping for love? No, he wept solely because his ego, bloated by the books he had consumed, had been bruised by something as trivial as a social invitation to a dance. His sorrow was so airy, so cheap. What he lamented was not the failure of two souls to find harmony, but rather the thought, how miserable my life shall be, simply because he would be unable to clasp that girl's waist at the dance the following night. What a selfish, hollow sorrow this was. There was no self-sacrifice in his tears, only the restless frustration of unfulfilled desire. And yet, at this very moment, a fatal misinterpretation occurred. My gaze shifted past that student, lost in his own self-pity, and drifted toward the green oak tree outside the window. Hidden within its branches lay the true, and indeed the finally protagonist of this tragedy, the nightingale. Here at last is a true lover, the nightingale murmured to herself. Though I have never met him, I have sung of him night after night. I have whispered his story to the stars, night after night. And now, at last, I behold him. Upon reading these lines, I was compelled to close the book and pause for a long while. I felt a crushing sense of suffocation tightening around my throat. Within this brief interior monologue, I witnessed one of the most tragic forms of dislocation in the landscape of human emotion, the tendency of noble souls to habitually project their own profound depth onto things that are, in reality, utterly shallow. The nightingale, a creature who had always held love as a sacred creed, devoting her entire existence to singing its praises, had all along been merely an observer. She understood every theory and ode to love, yet she had never truly experienced its reality. Thus, when she peered through the oak leaves and beheld that pale-faced, weeping young man, her mind immediately initiated a fatal process of romanticization. She failed to discern the selfishness and vanity lurking within the young man's tears. What she saw was the physical embodiment of the perfect model of love she held within her own heart. She mistook the few drops of cheap tears the young man shed, tears born of vanity, for holy water flowing in devotion to truth and beauty. I could not help but want to shout at the pages, "Silence! Nightingale! Look closely. That pathetic wretch weeping at the table is utterly unworthy of even a single one of your notes." But she could not hear me. This fervor of the bystander, this fatal blindness of the idealist, was pushing her, step by step, toward the abyss. "Love is a wonderful thing," said the nightingale. "It is more precious than emeralds, and dearer than fine opals. Pearls and pomegranates cannot buy it, nor is it set forth in the marketplace. It may not be purchased of the merchants, nor can it be weighed out in the balance for gold." As the nightingale sang this soliloquy from her perch on the branch, she was so utterly certain, so utterly pure. She had constructed a value system that was absolutely inviolable. Love is priceless. It transcends all material things. But what, then, is the logic by which the real world operates? Even as the nightingale voiced this sacred paean, the young man below continued to wallow in the dirt. "Without a red rose, I shall be a most wretched fellow." What a profoundly ironic montage this is! Above, the nightingale dwells among the clouds, staking her very life to defend the purity of love below. The young man wallows in the mire, reducing love to a mere object, a rose, to be bartered for a dance partner. The nightingale mistakenly believed that they shared the same language, the same faith. She did not know that, from the very start, they inhabited two entirely separate universes. One was the universe of the romantic, willing to burn itself out for the sake of the starry heavens. The other was the universe of the pragmatist, his mind consumed by calculations of how to secure a single night of pleasure at the lowest possible cost. Is this merely a fairy tale? In the real world, I have met far too many such nightingales. Those who, in matters of love, career, or faith, pour out their very souls and lay their hearts bare, often do so simply because, in a single, fleeting moment, they were moved by another person's tear, or a whispered prompt, believing they have encountered a true lover or a kindred spirit. They unhesitatingly surrender the fruits of their life's labor. They remain oblivious to the fact that the other person merely happened to be in need of a single red rose to attend a tawdry ball. From the very moment the nightingale resolved to seek out that red rose for this true lover, the shadow of death had already begun to loom over this narrative. This is not a tale of redemption through love. It is a suicide born of unilateral over-interpretation. The nightingale took flight. She set out to find the red rose that would save the young man's love. She flew first to the white rose, tree, and then to the yellow. Nature is both honest and indifferent. These trees could yield only roses the color of sea, foam, or amber. Here, Wilde inscribes a starkly ruthless law of physics and biology. The season is wrong. The bitter winter has frozen the trees' very veins, and heavy snows have snapped their branches. This serves, in fact, as a potent foreshadowing, to defy the laws of nature in a desperate quest for an ultimate red, for passion and perfection, is to be doomed to pay a price that is unnatural and perhaps even ruinous. Yet, the idealist, caught in the throes of fervor, remains blind to such omens. The nightingale finally arrived at the foot of the red rose tree, beneath the young man's window. What follows is a direct encounter with the most chilling and most distinctly Gothic horror. Dialogue in the entire story. It is a naked transaction of life itself. "If you want a red rose," said the tree, "you must build it out of music by moonlight, and stain it with your own heart's blood. You must press your breast against a thorn and sing to me. All night long you must sing to me, and the thorn must pierce your heart and your life. Blood must flow into my veins and become mine." Every time I read these lines, my fingertips turn cold. Take a moment to truly absorb the tone of that rose. It harbored no anger, no pity, not even a hint of seduction. It stood like a dispassionate physicist, or perhaps a cold, indifferent creator, articulating an objective formula of equivalent exchange. One perfect, out-of-season rose equals a full night of supreme artistry song, plus every drop of the creator's burning lifeblood. This was no longer the magic of fairy tales, the kind where a mere wave of a wand conjures a pumpkin carriage. This was the brutally cruel mechanics of sacrifice. Do you seek a beauty so absolute that it does not exist in this world? Very well, but you must pay with your life. How, then, did the nightingale feel as she confronted this pact, a covenant steeped in the heavy scent of blood? Let us zoom in for an extreme close-up of the nightingale reflected in her pupils. We witness the desperate struggle between life and death. Death is a heavy price to pay for a single red rose, the nightingale cried out. Life is precious to all living things, yet love is greater than life. Besides, how can a bird's heart ever compare to the heart of a man? This was the moment that filled me with the most profound anguish. A moment when I felt an overwhelming urge to reach into the pages of the book and deliver a sharp, stinging slap across her face. How can a bird's heart ever compare to the heart of a man? This sentence serves as the epitaph for every tragic martyr throughout history. Here, the nightingale committed her second, and ultimately fatal logical error, simply because the other party was a man, because he wore the outward trappings of civilization, philosophy, and intellectualism. She instinctively assumed was inherently nobler, vaster, and more profound than her own. She willingly relegated herself to a position of abject inferiority, employing a form of self-deprecation to construct the psychological framework for her martyrdom. She believed she was sacrificing herself for a magnificent human spirit, one capable of encompassing the very stars and seas. Yet we, possessing the privilege of an omniscient perspective, know the truth all too well. That young man's heart was nothing more than a shriveled hollow husk, a mere walnut shell filled to the brim with vanity and calculation. It is the heart of this tiny bird, this fragile creature about to be pierced by thorns, that stands as the only truly magnificent, truly burning entity in this entire universe. The noble debase themselves, while the base bask in unearned sublimity. Is there any misalignment more utterly despairing than this? Having made her decision, the nightingale flew back to the oak tree to bid the young man a final farewell. With her melodious voice, she told him, "Weep no more. I shall trade my very lifeblood to procure that red rose for you. I ask of you but one thing. Be a true lover." What was he doing? Did he comprehend this heart-rending vow? Here, Wilde, with a coolness bordering on the caustic, portrays the arrogance of reason and knowledge. The young man listened to the nightingale's song, yet he shed no tears, nor was he moved. Instead, he performed an act laden with modern metaphor. He took a notebook and a pencil from his pocket. "She has form," he said to himself. "Undoubtedly, her voice is beautiful, but does she possess feeling? In fact, she is like most artists, all technique, devoid of any genuine sincerity. She would not sacrifice herself for others. She thinks only of music." Bang! It is the gunshot of reason. It is the gunshot of academia. It is the public execution of a sincere heart, carried out by a self-absorbed modern man wielding cold, clinical logic, gazing at the drab pencil in the young man's hand, and then contemplating the vivid red blood the nightingale was about to shed. A profound sense of absurdity pierced me to the very core. The young man employed the very tools he had acquired: art criticism, logical analysis, and even psychological deconstruction, to pass judgment upon a living creature about to die for his sake. With the utmost arrogance, he arrived at the most foolish of conclusions. She would not sacrifice herself for others. He dismissed the nightingale's ultimate sacrifice as nothing more than a performance lacking in sincerity. Reading this passage, a chill ran through my entire body, for in this young man I saw all too many reflections of our own era. Have we too grown accustomed to behaving just like him, faced with the utmost sincerity of others, faced with acts of selfless devotion, undertaken without regard for the consequences? Our first reaction is no longer one of being moved. Instead, we pull out our internal notebooks, and through a lens that appears rational, even informed by psychological analysis, we proceed to deconstruct it. This is merely emotional labor. This is a manifestation of a people-pleasing personality. This lacks any underlying logical foundation. When we place everything upon the operating table of pure rationality to be dissected, we have, in truth, forfeited our capacity to perceive true greatness and compassion. Having finished writing his art critique, the young man closed his notebook, returned to his room, and lay down on his small bed. He thought of his beloved, and then he fell asleep. He fell asleep on the eve of a brutal sacrifice about to unfold, on this frigid night when someone was, at that very moment, laying down her life for his sake. He slept soundly, his conscience entirely at ease. As the full moon rose into the night sky, resembling a pale silvery metal, the nightingale flew toward the rose tree. She pressed her breast against the longest, sharpest thorn. I often wonder, when the tip of the thorn first pierced the nightingale's soft feathers, when that icy point pressed against her warm flesh, did she experience even a fleeting instant, perhaps a mere hundredth of a second, of regret? Did the primal instinct for survival trigger an involuntary spasm in her muscles? Will did not write of this. He stripped the nightingale of the biological instinct to seek pleasure and avoid pain, thereby elevating her directly onto a pedestal of divinity. She pressed her breast against the thorn and sang throughout the entire night. Even the cold crystal, like moon, leaned down to listen in silence. She sang all through the night. The thorn pierced ever deeper, and her lifeblood flowed into the veins of the rose tree. The sacrifice depicted here is not the swift, clean release of a single fatal blow. Rather, it is a prolonged, night-long agony, a slow, excruciating dismemberment of the soul, with a cruelty bordering on a kind of aesthetic pathology. Wilde divided the blooming of this rose into 3 distinct stages: These stages correspond precisely to the 3 successive steps by which an individual, in the pursuit of an ideal or a beloved, systematically strips themselves bare. The opening notes of her song spoke of love in its first awakening, accompanied by the song upon the highest branch of the rose tree. A miraculous rose began to unfold, yet it was pale. Wilde employed a succession of breathtaking metaphors: pale as the mist upon the river, pale as the footsteps of the morning, pale as the wings of dawn, pale as the shadow of a rose in a silver mirror, pale as the reflection of a rose in a pool. Why was it pale? Because, at this moment, the thorn had merely pierced the nightingale's skin. At this stage, love and the ideal remained confined solely to the realms of concept and spirit. It was beautiful, certainly, but it possessed no weight, no substance. It lacked one decisive element. Anything that has not endured the rending of flesh and been nourished by the shedding of blood, no matter how pure, remains, in the end, merely an illusory reflection. And so, the tree spoke. "Press closer, little nightingale," cried the tree, "or else the day will break before the rose is finished." This tree serves as a metaphor for that insatiable, ruthless God of art, or God of ideals. It is not content with mere superficiality. What it demands is absolute purity. The nightingale pressed closer still. We can almost hear the slow, tearing sound as the thorn pierced deeper into her flesh. Her song transformed, becoming more soaring, more fervent. She began to sing of the vibrant, life-affirming passion that exists between lovers. A miracle occurred. That pale rose began to take on a faint blush of red, like the blush that rises upon a bridegroom's face when he kisses the lips of his bride. Yet, this was still not enough. Although the edges of the rose's petals had turned red, its heart remained white, for only the blood from the nightingale's heart could stain the rose's heart red. Reading this passage, I was compelled to pause once more. I felt a profound, visceral unease. Here, through the voice of the rose tree, Wilde unveils a truth that drives all creators, and all those who love deeply, to despair no matter how much talent, time, or energy you pour forth. So long as you retain even the faintest shred of yourself, so long as you have not yet surrendered the innermost depths of your heart, there will forever remain a pale hollowness within the things you create and the ideals you pursue. Either give everything, or it counts as giving nothing at all. It is an absolute, ruthless form of extortion that leaves no room for compromise. Now, the climax of this sacrifice has arrived. So the nightingale pressed her breast ever more tightly against the thorn. The thorn pierced her heart, and a searing agony coursed through her entire body. The sharper the pain, the more intense it grew. The wilder and more frenzied became her song. Her final song no longer sang of the loves and passions between man and woman. Instead, she sang of asterisk that, which remains immortal even within the grave. This was no longer a song sung for that vain, slumbering youth. At the very moment her agony reached its zenith, the nightingale transcended that specific, mundane object of her affection. She was communing with life and death themselves. She was bringing to completion a work of art of absolute purity, one entirely detached from any utilitarian purpose. As the last drops of her lifeblood gushed forth, the red rose burst into magnificent bloom. It was red as the dawn breaking in the eastern sky, red as the feet of a dove, red as the coral of the deep sea in this flawed and imperfect world. It was the sole creation of absolute perfection. Yet, what was the cost? Let us observe how Wilde depicts this final scene. A passage charged with vivid visual intensity, even imbued with the pathos of religious martyrdom. The nightingale's voice grew fainter, her little wings began to flutter, and a film came over her eyes. Her song grew fainter still, and she felt something choking her in her throat. Then, with one last burst of musical ecstasy, she gave forth her final trill. The moon heard it. Forgetting the dawn, she lingered in the sky, refusing to depart. The red rose heard it. It trembled in ecstasy amidst the morning breeze. All of nature, even the very stars of the cosmos, stood awestruck before this exquisite masterpiece, purchased at the ultimate price of a life. This was the most fervent pinnacle of aestheticism, beauty triumphing over time, triumphing over the very laws of nature. Yet, on this glorious morning, a morning worthy of being etched into the annals of the universe, she fell to the soil beneath the rose tree. The nightingale lay dead in the long grass, with the thorn still buried in her breast. Faithud, * all the grand symphonic music came to an abrupt halt in that instant. All that remained was a cold, blood-stained bird's corpse. I stared at the short line of text on the page, tears welling up, threatening to spill over. This crushing sense of disparity felt like a heavy hammer smashing against my chest. So what if the universe was moved? So what if the rose was perfect? She was dead. She had died alone amidst the weeds, a thorn piercing her breast. There were no flowers, no applause, no funeral. Even the young man for whom she had poured out her very life, at this very moment, lay upstairs beneath his covers, dreaming vulgar, erotic dreams about the dance to be held the following night. In this meat grinder of art and life, the nightingale was ground to dust, squeezed dry to yield that single drop of pure crimson fluid left clinging to the branch. Her remains, meanwhile, were cast aside like worthless rags. I felt an indescribable blend of rage and desolation. We often speak of sacrificing life to attain virtue, or giving up one's life for righteousness. We are forever lauding those who make the ultimate sacrifice for some lofty ideal. Yet, when we truly gaze upon death in its concrete form, gazing at the bloodstains on the feathers, at those eyes rolled back and clouded over, all those grand narratives of greatness suddenly appear so cruel and dubious. Was it truly worth it to impale herself alive upon a thorn, all for the sake of an illusory concept called love, and for a fool who didn't understand her in the slightest? Was she a magnificent saint, or a raving lunatic? Dawn broke. Sunlight pierced through the cold night. The young student, who had slept so soundly, opened his window. Naturally, he had no idea what had transpired the night before. He knew only that he had just woken from a vulgar, erotic dream. Then he spotted it. Clinging to the branch was an incredible rose, a bloom as vivid and crimson as blood. "Ah," he cried, "here is a red rose. I have never in my whole life seen a rose so beautiful. It must surely have a very long Latin name." And so, he leaned out and plucked it. What a chilling exclamation that was. Ah, what luck! Here, Wilde reveals the most precise and most heart-freezing facet of his genius as a master of the caustic tongue. Confronted with a peerless masterpiece, purchased at the cost of an entire night of agonizing torture, and a life poured out in burning sacrifice, this erudite intellectual's first reaction was neither awe nor reverence, but simply luck. He airily reduced a supernatural miracle, a sacrifice steeped in blood and tears, to a mere statistical accident. He did not even cast a glance downward. Had he simply lowered his eyes, he would have seen, amidst the grass, the bird's corpse pierced through by thorns. Yet his gaze remained fixed solely upon the vivid fruit of that sacrifice, perched upon the branch above. His subsequent remark, "It must have a very long Latin name," etched the arrogance and cold-bloodedness of the intellectual with piercing precision. In his eyes, this rose was neither life nor love. It was merely a specimen, something to be catalogued within a biological taxonomy, something to be branded with an academic label. He sought to employ cold clinical terminology to tame and confine a form of transcendent beauty that lay utterly beyond his comprehension. With a clear conscience, he plundered the flower. Without hesitation, without gratitude, he seized the rose, still stained with the bird's blood, and rushed off in high spirits to the professor's home to seek out the girl he deluded himself into believing he loved. If the young man's reaction embodied the arrogance of reason, then the professor's daughter, who appears next, serves as the perfect embodiment of worldly shrewdness. The young man presented the rose to the girl seated beside the spinning wheel. "You promised that if I brought you a red rose, you would dance with me," the young student cried out. "Here is the reddest rose in all the world. Tonight, you shall wear it close to your heart, and as we dance together, it will whisper to you how deeply I love you." The young man's behavior here is nothing short of utterly farcical. He has the sheer audacity to claim that this rose serves as proof of just how deeply he loves her. He has not shed a single drop of blood, nor even a single genuine tear, yet he unhesitatingly appropriates the Nightingale's sacrifice as his own. Is this not the very epitome of the countless parasites that infest the real world? They pilfer the blood, sweat, and tears of the truly passionate, repackage them as their own assets, and then swagger about the arena of fame and fortune, engaging in shameless fraud. So did the girl accept it? As this sprawling narrative unfolds, we arrive at the novel's most absurd and most stomach-churning climactic moment. The girl frowned. "I'm afraid this flower won't match my gown," she replied. "Besides, the Chamberlain's nephew has given me some real jewels, and everyone knows that jewels are far more valuable than flowers." Reading these words aloud felt like gnawing on shards of barbed glass. "It doesn't match my dress. What an utterly absurd reason. A perfect rose, nurtured into existence by the very essence of life force, was, within this girl's system of values, reduced to nothing more than a superfluous encumbrance, unworthy even of serving as a mere accessory to her attire. In the face of such vulgar aesthetics, the sublime sanctity of the rose appeared utterly incongruous, and that subsequent remark, that jewelry is worth far more than flowers, served to ruthlessly lay bare the true mechanics of the adult world. This was no mere misalignment of sentiment. It was a full-scale, dimensional, level assault waged by class and capital. In the girl's eyes, the very concept of a rose symbolizing love simply did not exist. Instead, every object was crudely reduced to an equivalent monetary unit. The jewelry, a gift from the nephew of a court chamberlain, signified power, wealth, and a definitive ascent in social standing, whereas a single red rose, a gift from a student, possessing absolutely no liquid value, no matter how crimson and vivid it might be, held a market value that tended infinitely toward zero. As the nightingale sang out in the grove, proclaiming that love cannot be weighed in gold, how could she possibly have imagined that, mere hours later, the ultimate proof she had purchased with her very life would be utterly crushed by a shallow girl armed with nothing more than the simplest of creeds? The doctrine of jewelry value. The young man was enraged. Note well, He was not enraged for the Nightingale. He was enraged solely because his own pride had been trampled, and his investment had yielded no return. "How could you be so ungrateful?" the young student cried out in fury. He hurled the rose into the street. It landed in a rut, and a passing carriage rolled right over it. It faithud, asterisk if the Nightingale's death upon the thorns earlier represented a tragic epic, then the scene unfolding now. This rose, the very symbol of absolute purity, cast into the mud and ruthlessly crushed beneath the wheels of a carriage, represents a despairing void. It was not merely a flower being crushed. It was the Nightingale's faith. It was the last lingering trace of ultimate romanticism in this world, ground into dust, leaving not even a speck behind by the mud-caked wheels of realism. Those convictions, those cries that life is dear, but love is dearer still, proved utterly fragile when pitted against the color of a garment or the jewels of a courtier. This is the cruelest aspect of Wilde. He allows you to witness the birth of a miracle, only to cast that very miracle, like so much refuse, into a fetid gutter right before your eyes in that instant. I, as a reader, as a bystander, felt a profound sense of utter defeat. We had followed the Nightingale through that long and agonizing sacrifice. For a moment, we had even come to believe in the inherent worth of that sacrifice. But Wilde delivered a resounding slap across our faces, jolting us back to reality in a utilitarian society that understands nothing but the calculation of self-interest. Any act of pure sacrifice is nothing more than a joke. For nobility, quite simply, does not appear on their ledger of exchangeable values. The young man turned away, turning his back on the rose crushed within the carriage ruts, and walked toward his home. In this moment, as a young man who had just endured the pangs of heartbreak, if indeed the wounding of his cheap vanity could be dignified with such a name, what thoughts were passing through his mind? Hold your breath and listen to the final internal monologue Wilde penned for this young man. "What a silly thing love is," the young student murmured to himself as he walked. "It is not even half as useful as logic, for it proves nothing. It is always telling one of things that will not happen, and making one believe things that are not true. In fact, it is wholly unpractical. And as everything nowadays has to be practical, I shall go back to philosophy and study metaphysics. Every time I read this passage, I feel as though my mouth and nose are being stifled by a cold sheet of lead." These are perhaps the most spine-chilling lines in the entire novel. You see, he does not reflect on why he was rejected. He feels not the slightest pang of regret for that perfect rose of mysterious origin. He does not even experience a shred of genuine pain. Instead, he swiftly and deftly activates a powerful psychological defense mechanism, employing instrumental rationality to devalue anything he cannot obtain. It is not as useful as logic. It proves nothing. It is utterly impractical. How familiar these turns of phrase sound. Is this not, in fact, the dominant value system of our age? In this young man's logic, everything in the world must serve a purpose. Everything must be subject to the calculus of cost, benefit analysis. If a rose cannot secure a dance with a girl, it is devoid of value. If love cannot lead to a certain, demonstrable outcome, it is sheer folly. Employing a cold yet internally consistent logic, he dismissively reduces the Nightingale's earth-shattering, soul-stirring sacrifice to mere impracticality and unreality. It is akin to a person standing before a magnificent cathedral, who rather than experiencing a sense of awe in the presence of the divine, pulls out a tape measure and sneers. The usable floor area of this building is far too low, and the lighting is poor. It is truly impractical. What a tragic modern malady this is. We have armed our minds with knowledge, yet with logic we have murdered our souls. We no longer believe in those useless things, no longer believe in selfless giving, no longer believe in rushing headlong into the fray without regard for personal safety, no longer believe in the romance of shattering oneself completely for the sake of a pure ideal. The moment we encounter a setback, we immediately, much like this young man, retreat into a fortress named rationality and pragmatism, using it to mask the cowardice and spiritual poverty within our hearts. I followed the young man into his room. He sat down. It was here that Wilde penned the very last sentence of the entire story. That sentence, like the muffled toll of a funeral bell, brought this cruel fairy tale to its final close. So he went back to his room, took out a large dust-covered book, and began to read. I gazed at the figure seated at the desk, poring over that weighty tome, my eyes stung with unshed tears, yet not a single drop fell. What does that large dust-covered book symbolize? It stands as a metaphor for absolute rationality, for desiccated dogma, and for the safe mundane laws of the world. The young man has retreated into this pile of dust, where he has once again found his sense of security. He will shed no blood. He will not be pierced by thorns. He can live out his days in perfect safety. But he will never, ever know what love truly is. He has become nothing more than a gear within a vast machine, precise, smoothly functioning, yet utterly devoid of warmth. With this, Wilde brings his philosophical deduction to its conclusion, closing the loop with a profoundly pessimistic finality. The nightingale lies dead in the grass, a thorn piercing her breast, while the fool lives on in his room, turning the pages of a dust-laden book. In this world, those who are clear-headed, shrewd, and pragmatic invariably thrive. Yet those pure, steadfast souls, the nightingales, willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of ideals and love, are destined to be crushed beneath the wheels of reality. The question remains, shall we choose to be that nightingale? This film, spanning nearly 10,000 words, has finally reached its closing scene. From beginning to end, I meticulously scrutinized these pages filled with absurdity and blood. Throughout this spiritual odyssey centered on the nightingale and the rose, I dissected the nightingale's blindness, denounced the student's cold-bloodedness, and dismantled the girl's vulgarity. Yet, when the dust finally settled, when I closed this slender volume of fairy tales, my heart was left filled with an ultimate perplexity, a perplexity that, much like that very thorn, has pierced deep into my flesh. In a world that grows ever more rational, ever more shrewd, a world that increasingly elevates emotional stability and maximizing self-interest to the status of supreme principles, if sacrifice is destined to go uncomprehended, if one's very lifeblood is fated to be cast into the mire, then should we still aspire to be that nightingale? Reason tells me do not. Do not bleed for those who are unworthy. Do not chase after those ethereal absolute forms of purity. Learn when to cut your losses. Learn to see reality for what it is. Be merely a student, poring over his books, safe, steady, and unscathed. Yet, from the depths of my soul, a faint but stubborn voice rises in defiance. For I know with absolute certainty that if everyone were to become like that student, if the world were stripped of every heartbeat willing to sing itself to death for the sake of an impossible red rose, then this world would transform into nothing more than a vast, desolate, and utterly tedious mortuary. The tragedy of the Nightingale lies, admittedly, in the fact that she bestowed her devotion upon an unworthy recipient, yet viewed from another dimension, the moment she pressed her breast against the thorn and sang that song, immortal, even in the graves, she was no longer singing for the sake of that student. She was singing for the deity enshrined within her own heart. She was dying for the sake of that faith known as purity. Was her blood shed in vain? In the world of that student, it was indeed shed in vain. But within the vast dimension of the universe, in the eyes of the moon that stood still that night, and the rose tree that trembled in ecstasy, it was nothing less than an incomparable, magnificent coronation of art. Perhaps this is the truly elusive glimmer Wilde intended to leave us with in this despairing fairy tale. This world is unworthy of the Nightingale's song, yet that can never be a reason for us to cease singing. Even if, in the end, we are cast into the mire, even if we are crushed beneath the weight of reality, at least for that one night, we burned with a fierce, unreserved intensity. We created the reddest rose the world has ever seen, compared to a century spent merely subsisting in the dust. That single night of singing until one wept blood, that is what it truly means to live. The lights come back on. This film, steeped in intense subjective emotion, rife with questioning and internal conflict, truly comes to an end here. The clatter of the keyboard falls silent, yet the aftershocks of those words striking the soul still linger. My friend, in this calculating world of reality, I thank you for taking my hand, for spending such a long time, with such a heavy heart, keeping vigil with that nightingale as she shed her very last drop of blood. Now, this blood-stained red rose passes from the realm of my words into your hands. It is heavy, and its thorns prick the touch. How will you treat it? This is the final question left behind by our spiritual dialogue. There is no need to answer immediately. Let that faint, lingering sting remain within your heart for just a little while longer.